But in Amos chapter 6, we have, forgive me if I seem sarcastic, we have a picture of the charismatic movement. Amos chapter 6, beginning at verse 3. Now this is definitely not true of all charismatics. People ask me today when I go to see a doctor, what denomination are you? And I have difficulty in telling them. I used to say, well, if you know what the word charismatic means, and they don't, that's what I am. I don't feel free to say that any longer today, because so much has become mixed in that I totally disagree with. Anyhow, this is a cry of the Lord through the prophet Amos. You know, Amos means a burden. So he's the man with the burden, just beating it down. Woe to you who put far off the day of doom, which reminds me of what Johannes was saying in our first meeting. Are you putting far off the day of doom? I don't believe it's that far away. I really believe it's pretty close. Who cause the seed of violence to draw near. In other words, they exercise violent control over the poor. Who lie on beds of ivory, stretch out on your couches, eat lambs from the flock, and calves from the midst of the stall. They are living, as they say, high on the hog. They're really having a good time. Who chant to the sound of stringed instruments, and invent for yourselves musical instruments like David. They've got a real big orchestra. Very talented musicians. Who drink wine from bowls. That's probably not true of most charismatics. And anoint yourself with the best ointments. They're really living it up. They're having a good time. Just one problem. But you are not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. See, it's the same message. Are you sighing and crying? Are you grieved? Are you concerned with what's happening? Or are you just out to enjoy yourself? The number one problem of our age is love of self. And you can be very charismatic and very self-loving. And you can go to all the best conferences and listen to all the best music and spend much more on music than you do on teaching materials, which is true of the church today. But you're not grieved for the sufferings around you in the world. That's not the spirit of Jesus. It's far from the spirit of Jesus. And Paul says in Romans chapter 8, if any man does not have the spirit of Christ, he has none of his. The spirit of Christ was a humble, compassionate, loving, sacrificial spirit. I'm going to be honest with you. I receive invitations from time to time to conferences, big conferences. And I love the people that lead the conferences. They're my friends. But I have to say, I no longer feel free to go and live it up in these big conferences. And you can see them advertised in Charisma, page after page. I met the editor of Charisma, and he's a friend of mine, once years ago, by chance. And I said to him, you know, the articles in your magazine I find good. But when I read the advertisements, I feel afterwards I need a bath. So much self-promotion, self-aggrandizement, pride. If anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is not his. You can speak in tongues, even perform miracles. If you don't have that Spirit, you don't belong to Jesus. Remember, speaking in tongues is a gift. Performing miracles is a gift. Casting out demons is a gift. I have exercised those gifts. But you remember what Paul said? When you've received a gift, you're no better afterwards than you were before. It hasn't changed you a little bit. You could receive a gift of $1 million, have all the opportunities to do what you can do with $1 million, but it wouldn't change your character the least bit. If you were selfish, greedy, conceited, before you received the gift, you know what you'd be after you received the gift? Selfish, conceited, and greedy. See, the real problem, I think, with the charismatic movement is that we have put the gifts in the wrong place. They are not badges. They don't indicate a tremendous achievement in character. They are tools to be used in the service of the Lord. And when I think of those conferences, and I really didn't plan to say this, I think of all the money and the effort and the preachers, 10 preachers. And there are millions of people in the world that never see one preacher. My heart is for the lost. My heart is for the people who don't have. The motto of our ministry is reaching the unreached and teaching the untaught. And I don't feel free any longer to indulge in these occasions where we sit on couches and like the music of viols. No, I mean, thank God for worship music, please understand me. But if it's all self-serving, it's not good. I take you back to 2 Timothy chapter 3. The number one problem of our age is love of self. And then Paul says in the 5th verse, if people can't get over that, don't waste time on them. That's the Prince version. You can check it for yourself. Personally, as far as I'm able, and in many ways I'm not able, I do not waste time on ministering to people who will not change. I hope some of you have changed. I trust that some of you may change. But if you haven't changed and won't change, this conference for you is a waste of time. All right. Let's go on to Ezekiel chapter 22. This is a declaration of God's final judgment on Israel at this time. And beginning at verse 23, it says, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, say to her, that's the land of Israel, you are a land that is not cleansed or rained on in the day of indignation. And my mind goes back, how many years? Nearly 40 years, when Wilson Mambaleo was a student in the college of which I was the principal. And I heard him say, and I don't suppose he even remembers saying it, but he said, the only thing that can cleanse a land is the rain of the Holy Spirit. And it stuck with me all those years. The only thing that can cleanse a land is the rain of the Holy Spirit. And this land of Israel had not received that rain, and it was not cleansed. And then the prophet goes on. And we deal now with 4 groups of people. And it so happens by an accident in the English language that all 4 begin with the letter P. So it's easy to remember them. Prophets, priests, princes, and people. But notice that God does not begin with the people. He doesn't even begin with the princes. Actually, he doesn't even begin with the priests. He begins with the prophets. And that is the source of the problem. The prophet is the one who interprets to God's people God's will and God's ways. And if the interpretation is false, people will go astray. Shall I just read for a moment? The conspiracy of her prophets in her midst is like a roaring lion. Reading the next verse, 26. Her priests have violated my law and profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between the holy and unholy, nor have they made known the difference between the unclean and clean. How true that is of the contemporary church. Her princes in her midst are like wolves tearing the prey. Then we come back to the prophets. Her prophets plastered them with untempered mortar. They were patching things up to make them look good and spiritual, but they wouldn't stand the test. Elsewhere, it says in the Bible that the wall that is plastered with untempered mortar will fall, and its ruin will be great. And finally, we come to the people of the land. But you see, very often as Christians, we'll focus on the people. And we can list all their problems, and they have many. But that's not where God starts. He doesn't even start with the princes, the rulers, the government. He starts with the church. That's where the root of the problem is. And he starts with the prophets, the ones who claim to represent God and portray the will and the way of God, who speak on behalf of God. Brothers and sisters, it's a very great responsibility to claim to speak on behalf of God. I want to take you just briefly through some scriptures about prophets. If you go to, and I don't go, but I'm sure it's true, to a gathering of the New Age, you know what you'll meet? A gathering of false prophets. They're abundant. It's very interesting. In the time of spiritual decline, false prophets multiply. In the time of Elijah, in the latter part of the reign of Ahab, there were 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, a pagan, immoral deity. That's 850 false prophets. And we only know one true prophet. His name was Elijah. There were 7,000 in Israel that had not bowed the knee, but they were not prophets. So after the descent of the fire, Elijah executed 850 false prophets. Do you think about prophets doing things like that? Cutting the heads off? Well, it's part of the prophetic ministry. So you say, all right, 850 false prophets are gone, that will clear the air. No. Just a little later, still in the reign of Ahab, Ahab is trying to persuade Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, to go up to war against Ramoth Gilead, and he's got 400 false prophets. And there again, there's only one true prophet. His name was Micaiah. He was the only one who told the truth. So in that period, you have 1,250 false prophets and 2 true prophets. Do you think the profession is different today? And if so, how different? I don't think it's very different. Now, I want to say just a few things about judging prophets. Let me also make this comment. Once upon a time, some of you can remember, I used to be a featured speaker for the Full Gospel Visitors Fellowship, and thank God for them. But I really had a problem with them because they encouraged people to prophesy but never checked the prophecies. And they got some very screwy prophecies. I don't believe it's scriptural to permit the gift of prophecy without having it checked. That doesn't mean you clump down on everybody, but everybody knows they're accountable for what they've said. And there should be a leadership there that is capable of checking. Anyhow, let me give you just 2 things about false prophets, both from the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 13. We're going to look at verses 1 through 5. And now this is a very remarkable passage and contains a very important lesson. Deuteronomy 13, beginning at verse 1. If there arises among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes to pass, of which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, which you have not known, and let us serve them. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you, to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice. And you shall serve him and hold fast to him. That's a remarkable situation. Here is a prophet who gives a supernatural sign, a prediction, and it's fulfilled. But he's not from God.